A millionaire's son invites a beggar home only to find out she's his mother. What starts as a simple act of kindness turns into a haunting mystery. Why does this woman know the lullaby from his childhood? She cooks like someone who raised him and says things no stranger should know. Then he finds a locket with his baby photo inside. Could the woman he was told was dead be the mother he's been missing his whole life? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Tom Bennett woke with a start as his alarm chimed softly. Outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, snowflakes danced against the Manhattan skyline. The city looked small from his penthouse on the 68th floor. Tiny people scurrying like ants. Yellow taxis crawling through slush-filled streets. He sat up in his king-sized bed, sheets of Egyptian cotton sliding away from his chest. Everything in the room was white, black, or glass. No photos, no color, no mess. Just like his father had taught him. Tom rubbed his eyes and checked his watch. 6:30. Right on schedule, as always. In the bathroom, he stared at himself in the mirror. At 35, he had his father's strong jaw and calculating eyes. The face of success, according to Forbes magazine, which had featured him last month. The Prince of Manhattan real estate, they'd called him. The thought didn't warm him as he splashed cold water on his face. By 7, Tom sat at his glass dining table overlooking Central Park. The breakfast his housekeeper had prepared sat steaming before him. 2 eggs, wheat toast, black coffee. The same breakfast he'd eaten for 15 years. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," Julia said, entering with her tablet in hand. She wore a simple gray suit, her dark hair pulled back neatly. "Your schedule is quite full today." "It always is," Tom replied, not looking up from the financial report he was scanning. Julia cleared her throat. "The charity proposal needs your final review before the board meeting at 10. Tom sipped his coffee. "What else?" "Your father called. Twice. He wants to see you before the merger meeting." At the mention of his father, Tom's shoulders stiffened slightly. "Fine, schedule it." Julia hesitated, then sat down across from him. This wasn't like her. Tom raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Bennett, Tom, this merger will make Bennett Enterprises the largest real estate developer on the East Coast. Your grandfather started this company from nothing. Your father turned it into an empire. And now you're taking it global." Her voice was soft but clear. "It's quite a legacy." Tom put down his coffee cup. "A legacy is just another word for a prison, Julia." "Is that how you see it?" He didn't answer, just stared out at the snow-covered city. "Tell my father I'll see him at 11. Charles Bennett's office made Tom's penthouse look cozy. It occupied the entire top floor of the Bennett building, all marble and mahogany. At 80, Charles still stood straight as a ruler, his silver hair perfectly combed, his eyes sharp as winter ice. "You're late," Charles said instead of hello. "By 2 minutes," Tom replied, checking his watch. "Traffic." Charles waved this away like an annoying fly. "I read your revisions to the charity proposal. And it's garbage." Charles tossed the folder onto his massive desk. $5 million to renovate homeless shelters? What are we, the Salvation Army? Tom kept his face blank, though something twisted in his stomach. It's good PR. The press will forget in a week. Meanwhile, we've wasted money that could be invested in the Chelsea property. Charles walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "We don't feed the poor. We build where they'll never live." Tom had heard this speech before, since childhood, really. The Bennett way was clear. Profit above all. People were either useful or obstacles. "The merger papers are ready," Tom said, changing the subject. Charles turned, his thin lips almost smiling. "Good. At least you haven't completely lost your mind." He studied his son with cold eyes. "This merger is everything, Tom. Your grandfather built from dirt. I built from brick. You will build from gold. That's the Bennett legacy." Tom nodded, feeling the familiar weight settle on his shoulders. A legacy of ice, he thought, but didn't say. A winter evening, 28 years earlier. The Bennett family lawyer's office was quiet except for the soft ticking of an antique clock and the muffled sobs of a young woman. Grace Morgan, barely 22, held her baby boy against her chest. Little Tom, just 8 months old, slept peacefully, unaware of the heartbreak unfolding around him. His tiny fingers curled around a loose strand of his mother's honey-brown hair. "Sign here, Miss Morgan." The notary's voice was professionally detached as he pointed to the final line on the custody papers. Grace's hand trembled. "Please," she whispered, looking up at Charles Bennett. "Please don't do this." Charles stood by the window, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the office carpet. At 45, he was already a titan of New York real estate, his name on buildings across Manhattan. His face remained expressionless. "The terms are generous," he said coldly. "The money will set you up comfortably, far away from here." "I don't want your money," Grace's voice cracked. "He's my son. Our son." Charles adjusted his gold cufflinks. "A Bennett heir cannot be raised by a waitress from Queens. It would be unsuitable." Grace pressed her lips to Tom's forehead, tears falling onto his soft baby blanket. "He needs his mother." "He needs the Bennett name more," Charles replied. "Sign the papers, Grace." With each stroke of the pen, Grace felt her heart breaking. When she finally handed over her baby boy, her legs nearly gave out beneath her. "You'll regret this," she whispered to Charles. "Someday you'll see what you've done." Charles didn't respond. He simply nodded to his lawyer and took the sleeping baby from Grace's arms. Present day. Tom sat alone in his father's private archive room, surrounded by file boxes labeled by year. The merger paperwork had raised questions about old property acquisitions, sending him digging through Bennett history. A manila folder slipped from his hands, spilling black and white photographs across the polished floor. As he gathered them, one image made him pause. A young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile held a baby. The photo was dated nearly 30 years ago. In the corner, someone had written simply, "Deceased, 2010. Tom stared at the woman's face. Something about her eyes seemed familiar, though he couldn't place why. He slipped the photo into his jacket pocket without thinking. The annual Bennett Enterprises Gala filled the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over New York's elite as they clinked champagne glasses and closed deals between dance numbers. Charles paraded Tom around like a prized thoroughbred. "My son will take Bennett global," he boasted to a group of investors. "The merger is just the beginning." Tom smiled on cue, shook hands, quoted profit margins. The perfect heir. As the evening wore on, Tom found himself at the bar beside Harold Winters, an old family investor. "Manhattan's prince," Harold chuckled, raising his scotch in a toast. "Though I must say, those eyes of yours, same as hers." Tom paused mid-sip. "Excuse me?" "Your mother," Harold said, his voice softened by alcohol. "Same expressive eyes. Shame what happened." Tom's heart quickened. "My mother died when I was an infant." Harold looked confused. "Is that what Charles told you? Well, I suppose it's not my business." He cleared his throat. "Congratulations on the merger, my boy." As Harold walked away, Tom stood frozen, the photograph in his pocket suddenly feeling much heavier. Tom hurried out of the Bennett Enterprises building, phone pressed to his ear. The merger details were becoming more complex by the hour, and his father expected perfection. "I need those numbers verified by morning," he instructed his assistant, as the cold evening air bit at his face. Winter had settled over New York City, turning the sidewalks into rivers of hurried, bundled figures. As he paced under the building's grand awning, something caught his eye. A woman sat huddled on a bench near the entrance, a thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Most people walked past without a glance, as if she were invisible. "I'll call you back," Tom said abruptly, ending the call. The woman wasn't asking for money or holding a sign. She simply sat there, her face weathered but dignified, looking out at the falling snow. Something about her seemed oddly familiar. When she noticed Tom watching her, she smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I just needed to rest a moment out of the cold. I'll move along shortly." Tom found himself unable to look away from her eyes, kind eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and warmth. "Are you all right?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Just catching my breath," she replied. "These old bones don't move like they used to in the cold." A gust of wind made her shiver, and Tom felt an unexpected pang in his chest. "There's a cafe across the street. Let me buy you some soup at least." The woman hesitated. "That's very kind, but please," Tom insisted, not understanding his own urgency. "It's freezing out here." She studied his face for a long moment. "Thank you," she finally said. As they waited for the soup, Tom found himself making another impulsive offer. "My apartment is upstairs. It's warm. You could have your soup there if you'd like." The woman, who had introduced herself simply as Grace, looked stunned. "I couldn't impose." "It's no imposition," Tom said, though he'd never invited a stranger to his home before. Later, in his penthouse, Grace sat at his dining table, her hands wrapped around a steaming bowl. She ate slowly, her eyes occasionally drifting around the apartment with quiet curiosity. "I'll be right back," Tom said, excusing himself to take another call from his assistant. While he was gone, Grace's gaze fell on a small framed photograph on the bookshelf. She rose from her chair and moved closer, drawn to it as if by some invisible force. In the photo, a toddler with bright eyes smiled at the camera, sitting on Charles Bennett's lap. Grace's hands began to tremble so badly she had to set her soup down. She reached out, fingers hovering just above the frame, not quite touching it. "That's me," Tom said, returning to the room. "With my father. The only photo he ever allowed in the house." Grace quickly pulled her hand back, but not before Tom noticed the trembling. Tom stared at his soup, barely touching it. His father's words from earlier that day echoed in his mind like a warning bell. "Remember who you are, Tom," Charles had said, his voice cold and precise as they stood in his office overlooking the city. "A Bennett doesn't waste time entertaining people who don't belong. That's how we've maintained our position." Now, sitting across from Grace at his dining table, Tom felt oddly conflicted. This woman was clearly not from his world. Her clothes were worn, her hands rough from work. Yet something about her presence felt strangely right in his sterile apartment. "This soup is absolutely wonderful," Grace said, breaking the awkward silence. Her eyes crinkled with genuine appreciation. "Such rich flavor. I haven't had a meal this good in ages." Tom glanced at the simple takeout container. "It's just from the deli downstairs." "Sometimes the simplest things are the most special," Grace replied, smiling warmly. When they finished eating, Grace immediately stood and gathered their bowls. "Please, let me clean up. It's the least I can do for your kindness." "You don't have to," Tom began. "I insist," she said firmly, already carrying dishes to the kitchen sink. Tom watched, bewildered. No one had ever washed dishes in his apartment before. His cleaning service handled everything. "Thank you again," Grace called over her shoulder. Not many people would open their home to a stranger. Tom shifted uncomfortably. "You can stay on the couch tonight," he found himself saying. "I have a guest robe you can use. It's too cold out there." Grace's eyes widened with surprise. "That's too generous." "It's nothing," Tom said, though it was anything but nothing. This broke every rule of his carefully ordered life. After showing Grace where everything was, Tom retreated to his bedroom to answer emails. The merger documents needed his attention, but he found himself distracted, listening to the soft sounds of movement in his kitchen. Then he heard it, a gentle humming, a simple melody, soft and sweet. Tom stood up from his desk and moved to the hallway, drawn by the sound. He stopped just short of the kitchen entrance, his heart suddenly pounding. Grace stood at the sink, her back to him, humming quietly as she washed the few dishes they'd used. Her voice was barely audible, but the melody cut through Tom like a blade. He knew that song. Tom froze, one hand against the wall to steady himself. The melody transported him somewhere, a hazy memory of warmth and safety, of being held, of falling asleep to that very tune. But that was impossible. His mother had died when he was too young to remember her. He had no memories of lullabies or bedtime songs, yet the melody resonated within him like a forgotten truth. Tom's meeting had dragged on longer than expected. The merger negotiations were becoming increasingly complex, with both sides pushing for more favorable terms. By the time he stepped off the elevator to his penthouse, his shoulders ached with tension and his mind buzzed with financial projections. He opened his door, expecting the familiar silence of his empty apartment. Instead, the scent of fresh tea greeted him. Tom paused, momentarily disoriented. Grace stood in his living room, a neatly folded stack of his clothes on the coffee table. She wore the same clothes as yesterday, but had clearly washed her face and combed her hair. She looked up when he entered, her smile warm and natural. "You're back," she said. "I hope you don't mind. I found your laundry basket and thought I'd make myself useful." Tom stared at the folded clothes, then at the steaming cup of tea on the counter. No one had done his laundry by hand since, well, he couldn't remember when. "You seem too busy to take care of yourself," Grace added, her voice gentle. Tom set down his briefcase, unsure how to respond. His personal space had been invaded, yet it didn't feel threatening. It felt familiar. "I should have asked first," Grace said, noticing his hesitation. "I just wanted to repay your kindness." Tom picked up one of his dress shirts from the pile. It was his favorite silk one, the pale blue that his assistant Julia always complimented. He noticed something different about the sleeve. "You fix this," he said, running his finger over the small, nearly invisible stitches where the fabric had torn last month. He'd been meaning to take it to his tailor. "It was a simple repair," Grace said. "The tear was clean." Tom studied the stitching. The technique was distinct, tiny, even stitches that blended perfectly with the fabric. A memory flickered at the edge of his consciousness. "My mother used to fix my clothes like this," he said quietly, surprised by his own words. "At least, I think she did. I don't remember her much." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed another shirt. "How did you know I wouldn't mind?" Tom asked, genuinely curious. She looked up at him, her eyes suddenly filled with something deeper than kindness. "A mother knows," she said softly. The words hung in the air between them. Tom stiffened, his fingers tightening on the shirt. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. Grace's eyes widened with alarm. She laughed, a nervous, fluttering sound, and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I just meant, it's a saying, you know, about intuition." She busied herself with the remaining laundry, not meeting his eyes. "Mothers have that instinct, so they say. I've heard that expression all my life." Tom stood motionless, studying her downturned face. The tension in the room was palpable, like a string pulled too tight. Tom's phone rang, shattering the uncomfortable silence between them. He glanced at the screen and his jaw tightened. "Bennett," he answered sharply, turning away from Grace. "What do you mean they're backing out? The presentation is tomorrow." He paced toward the window, his free hand raking through his perfectly styled hair. "We've been working on this pitch for months. My father has already announced it to the board." Grace quietly continued folding clothes, but her eyes followed him as he moved across the room. "Fine. Send me the revised projections. I'll work on it tonight." Tom ended the call and tossed his phone onto the couch with more force than necessary. "Bad news?" Grace asked softly. Tom let out a humorless laugh. "Our biggest potential client is having second thoughts about the development project. If I don't convince them tomorrow, my father will—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Will what?" Grace asked, setting down the shirt she was folding. Tom's shoulders slumped slightly. "He'll know he was right about me." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Can I say something?" Tom nodded, surprised by his own willingness to listen to this stranger. "Sometimes we make decisions trying to please others, especially parents." Her eyes held a depth of understanding that made Tom stand straighter. "But at the end of the day, You have to make choices for yourself, not just for someone else's legacy." Tom stared at her. The words struck something deep inside him, a truth he'd been avoiding for years. "How did you—" he began, but stopped himself. "Thank you. I should get to work." Hours later, with Grace asleep in the guest room, Tom found himself digging through a storage box he kept hidden in his closet. Something about Grace's words, about her humming that lullaby, had awakened a desperate curiosity in him. The box contained the few items he'd kept from his childhood. His father had discarded most things when they moved into the penthouse, claiming they needed a fresh start. At the bottom of the box, beneath old report cards and a Little League trophy, Tom found a yellowed piece of paper. His heart raced as he unfolded it carefully. There, written in delicate handwriting, were the notes and lyrics to the same lullaby Grace had been humming. At the bottom of the page were the words, "To my baby boy, Mom." Tom's hands trembled. He glanced toward the guest room, his mind racing. Drawn by an instinct he couldn't explain, Tom quietly entered the guest room. Grace was sleeping peacefully, her breathing deep and even. His eyes fell to the pillow beside her, where something gold glinted in the dim light. Carefully he reached for it, a small tarnished locket. His fingers fumbled as he opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph of a baby, himself, and tucked behind it, a hospital identification band. Tom stared, his world tilting on its axis. The next morning, Tom Bennett stood in the doorway of his kitchen, watching Grace move around the space as if she'd been there for years. She hummed that same haunting melody while cracking eggs into a bowl, her movements fluid and practiced. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. "I hope you like omelets," Grace said without turning around. "I found some vegetables in your fridge that needed using." Tom didn't answer. His mind was too full of questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. The locket he'd discovered last night weighed heavily in his pocket. "You don't have to cook for me," he finally said. Grace turned, a gentle smile on her face. "I know. I want to." She slid a perfectly folded omelet onto a plate and placed it on the counter. "You need a good breakfast before your big presentation." Tom felt a chill run through him. He hadn't mentioned his presentation to her. "How did you know about that?" he asked. Grace's hands stilled for just a moment. "You mentioned it yesterday during your phone call." Had he? Tom couldn't remember. Everything felt hazy, like he was moving through a dream. At the office, Tom stared blankly at the presentation on his computer screen. The words blurred together, meaningless. The locket sat on his desk, unopened. Julia knocked softly before entering with a stack of documents. "These need your signature before the meeting." She paused, studying his face. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Tom rubbed his eyes. "I don't even know who I let into my home." Julia set the papers down. "What do you mean?" "This woman, Grace. She showed up outside the building 2 days ago. I let her stay in my guest room, and now—" He gestured helplessly. "She knows things. Things about me she shouldn't know." "Have you asked her about it?" Julia's voice was gentle. Tom shook his head. "I'm afraid of the answer." When Tom returned home that evening, the apartment was quiet. He called out Grace's name, but received no answer. Moving through the living room, he spotted her on the couch, fast asleep. In her arms, she cradled his old stuffed bear, the one with the worn ear and missing eye that his father had tried to throw away countless times. Tom had kept it hidden in a box at the back of his closet, beneath winter clothes he never wore. He stood frozen, staring at the bear. The ear that had been hanging by threads was now neatly stitched back in place, the worn patches carefully mended. He never told her about the bear, never showed her where it was kept, never mentioned it existed. As if sensing his presence, Grace stirred slightly, holding the bear closer to her chest. Tom watched Grace from the doorway as she tidied up the kitchen. She moved with such familiar ease, as if she'd been in his home for years instead of days. The morning light caught the silver in her hair as she hummed that melody, the one that stirred something deep inside him. "Would you like some coffee?" Grace asked without turning around, somehow sensing his presence. "Yes," Tom replied, stepping into the kitchen. "Please." They sat across from each other at the breakfast bar, steam rising from their mugs. Tom studied her face, the gentle lines around her eyes, the way her hands cradled the cup as if savoring its warmth. "You seem to know more about me than a stranger should," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. Grace's eyes flickered down to her coffee. "Sometimes people just connect. Don't you believe in intuition?" "Not particularly," Tom answered. "I believe in facts, and the fact is, you knew about my presentation. You found my childhood bear. You even stitch like—" He stopped himself. "Like who?" Grace asked softly. Tom shook his head. "No one. It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. As Grace busied herself with washing their cups, Tom closed his eyes, letting himself drift back to a memory he wasn't even sure was real. Small hands holding his after a nightmare. The scent of lavender. A woman's voice singing that same lullaby as she stroked his hair. His father had always told him the nannies had raised him after his mother died. But this memory felt different. It felt real. Tom opened his eyes and watched Grace's hands as she dried a plate. The same gentle movements, the same slight tremble in the right pinky finger. "I should get to work," he said abruptly, standing up. The memory was too much, too confusing. Grace nodded. "Have a good day, Tom." Tom returned home earlier than expected that evening. The apartment was quiet, but a soft glow came from the living room. As he approached, he heard it, that lullaby again, but not hummed this time. It was playing from the television. He rounded the corner to find Grace sitting on the floor in front of the entertainment center, an old home video playing on the screen. A young woman was holding a baby, singing softly as she rocked him. Grace hadn't heard Tom come in. She was crying, silent tears streaming down her face as she watched the screen with such longing, it made Tom's chest ache. "Grace?" he said quietly. She startled, quickly wiping her eyes. "Tom, I didn't expect you so early." "What are you watching?" he asked, though he could see clearly enough. "I was just—" She gestured helplessly at the screen. "I found these old tapes on your shelf. I was just remembering someone I lost." Tom tossed and turned in his bed, sheets tangled around his legs. In his dream, he was small, maybe 3 years old, sitting in a courtroom with its towering wooden benches and stern-faced adults. His tiny hands reached out, stretching toward someone being pulled away. He was screaming, tears streaming down his face. But he couldn't see who he was reaching for. Her face was a blur, just beyond his memory's grasp. He jolted awake at midnight, heart hammering against his ribs. Sweat dampened his forehead as he sat up, trying to shake off the dream's grip. It felt too real to be just a nightmare, more like a memory trying to surface. "What's happening to me?" he whispered into the darkness. Morning came too quickly. Tom dressed mechanically, his mind still replaying fragments of the dream. He checked on Grace, who was making breakfast in the kitchen, before slipping out early. Instead of heading to the office, he drove to his father's estate in the suburbs. Charles Bennett was in his study reviewing documents when Tom entered without knocking. "This is unexpected," Charles said without looking up. "The merger paperwork isn't ready yet." Tom stood rigidly by the door. "I'm not here about the merger." Something in his tone made Charles finally look up, his eyes narrowing. "What is it then?" "Do you remember her?" Tom asked, his voice strangely calm despite the storm inside him. "The woman who raised me for the first year?" Charles's face hardened. He carefully set down his pen and leaned back in his leather chair. "Why are you asking about ancient history?" "Just answer the question." "She was a nanny. One of many." Charles waved his hand dismissively. "She didn't matter." "She didn't matter," Tom repeated slowly. "Or you didn't want her to matter?" Charles stood up, his patience visibly thinning. "I raised you, Tom. I built everything you have. Whatever you think you're looking for in the past won't change that." Tom left without another word, his father's deflection only strengthening his suspicions. That night, he returned home late. The apartment was quiet. He checked the guest room and found Grace asleep, her breathing soft and even. In her hand was the locket he'd seen before, the one she'd hidden under the pillow. Carefully, trying not to wake her, Tom slipped the locket from her fingers. She stirred, but didn't wake. His hands trembled as he opened the small golden heart. Inside was the photo he'd glimpsed before, a baby with his eyes, his nose. But now he recognized something else. The hospital bracelet visible on the baby's wrist matched the one in his dream. This wasn't just any baby, it was him. Tom barely slept that night. The locket felt heavy in his hand as he paced his bedroom, the photo of baby Tom with the hospital bracelet burning into his mind. By dawn, his confusion had hardened into determination. He needed answers, real ones this time. When the first light broke through the windows, Tom marched down the hallway to the guest room. He didn't knock. The door swung open with a bang that made Grace sit up in bed, her eyes wide with alarm. "Tell me the truth," Tom demanded, holding up the locket so it dangled between them. "Who are you? Really?" Grace's face drained of color. Her hands began to shake as she clutched the blanket to her chest. I found that," she stammered. "I shouldn't have kept it. I'm sorry." "Stop lying," Tom said, his voice trembling with emotion. "That's me in the photo, isn't it? And this?" He pulled out his phone and played the lullaby from the home video he'd found. The gentle melody filled the room. The moment the music started, Grace's composure crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. "I sang that," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Every night, until they took you away." Tom stood frozen, the phone still playing in his hand. "What are you saying?" Grace looked up at him, years of hidden pain etched across her face. "I'm your mother, Tom." The words hung in the air between them. Tom felt like the floor was tilting beneath his feet. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "My mother is dead. My father told me—" "Your father paid me to disappear," Grace interrupted, her voice stronger now that the truth was finally coming out. "He threatened to take everything from me, including you, unless I signed those papers and never contacted you again." Tom sank onto the edge of the bed, trying to process what he was hearing. "But why would he?" "I was young, poor, not the kind of mother Charles Bennett wanted for his son and heir." Grace's hands twisted in her lap. "He said you deserved better than me. And maybe you did. But not a day went by that I didn't think about you. Wonder how you were growing up." Tom stared at the locket in his hand, then back at Grace's face. Now that he was looking, really looking, he could see it. His eyes, the shape of his mouth, the way her hands moved when she spoke. "All this time," he whispered, his world crumbling under him. "All these years. He told me you abandoned us, that you chose to leave." "I would never have left you willingly," Grace said, reaching out but stopping short of touching him. "You were everything to me." Tom's hands balled into fists as the truth settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The elegant penthouse that had always felt so empty now seemed to close in around him. His breathing quickened, each inhale bringing a new wave of betrayal. "If what you're saying is true," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "then why didn't you fight for me?" His volume rose with each word until he was nearly shouting. "Why didn't you come back for me?" Grace flinched at his anger but didn't back away. Tears streamed down her weathered face, carving paths through decades of hidden pain. "I tried, Tom. God knows I tried." Her voice broke. "I wrote letters that came back unopened. I called until they changed the number. I even stood outside your preschool once just to see you." She wiped her tears with trembling fingers. "Your father had me removed by security. Said he'd have me arrested if I came near you again." "You could have fought harder." Tom slammed his hand against the wall, making the framed artwork rattle. "You were my mother." "I was 22, Tom. Alone. No money, no family to help me." Grace's shoulders slumped under the weight of her confession. Charles had teams of lawyers. He told the judge I was mentally unstable, unfit to be a mother. He had witnesses who testified I couldn't care for you properly. Tom paced the room like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair. So you just gave up? Let him erase you from my life? He gave me a choice, Grace whispered. Sign the papers and stay away, or he'd make sure I never saw you again anyway, and he'd destroy any chance I had at building a life for myself. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. I thought maybe when you were older, when you could decide for yourself. But you never came back, Tom spat, disgust dripping from every word. How could I? He told you I was dead. Grace's voice rose for the first time. I didn't know that until yesterday when I saw that photo labeled deceased. All these years, I thought you knew I existed but didn't want me. Tom couldn't bear to look at her anymore. The mother he'd mourned without knowing, the abandonment he'd internalized, it was all built on his father's lies. The foundation of his entire life was crumbling beneath him. I need air, he muttered, grabbing his coat. I can't do this right now. Tom, please. Grace reached for him, but he jerked away from her touch. Don't. The word cut through the air like a knife. Without another glance, Tom stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. In the silence that followed, Grace sat motionless for several minutes. Then, with quiet resignation, she began to gather her few belongings. She folded the borrowed clothes neatly, wiped away her tears, and packed the small bag she'd arrived with. Before leaving, she placed the locket carefully on the coffee table. Beside it, she left a note. I'll always love you, even if you hate me. Tom's footsteps echoed through the marble lobby of Bennett Tower as he stormed toward the elevator. His face was a storm of emotions, rage, confusion, grief, all battling for dominance. The security guard nodded at him, then quickly looked away, sensing the tension radiating from the younger Bennett. The executive elevator whisked him to the top floor where his father's office occupied the entire east wing. Tom didn't bother knocking. He pushed past Charles's assistant, who rose from her desk with a startled protest. Charles Bennett was standing at his floor-to-ceiling windows, silhouetted against the Manhattan skyline, phone pressed to his ear. He turned at the intrusion, annoyance flickering across his face before settling into his usual mask of cool control. I'll call you back, he said into the phone, ending the call. Thomas, this is unexpected. Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out Grace's locket. With a flick of his wrist, he sent it skidding across the polished mahogany desk. It spun to a stop in front of Charles, the gold catching the light. You lied to me my entire life. Tom's voice was low, dangerous. Charles barely glanced at the locket. He straightened his tie and sat down, gesturing for Tom to do the same. Sit down, Thomas, you're being dramatic. I met her, Tom said, remaining standing. My mother, the woman you told me was dead. A flash of something, surprise, perhaps even fear, crossed Charles's face before disappearing. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. She was nothing, he said flatly. I did what was best for our name, for your future. My future? Tom's laugh was bitter. You mean your legacy, your empire. You never cared about me. Charles sighed, as if dealing with a petulant child. She was a waitress, Thomas. No education, no family connections. What could she possibly have offered you? I gave you everything. Except the truth. Tom slammed his hands on the desk, making the crystal paperweight jump. You made me believe my own mother abandoned me, that she was dead. It was cleaner that way. Charles's voice remained calm, unaffected, less complicated. Tom stared at his father, seeing him clearly for the first time. The cold, calculating eyes, the complete absence of remorse. This man had destroyed lives, including his own sons, all to protect his precious empire. You're a monster, Tom whispered. Charles's expression hardened. I'm a businessman. Sentimentality is weakness, Thomas. I thought I'd taught you that. Tom turned away, disgusted. He needed proof. something concrete to confirm everything Grace had told him, and he knew exactly who could help. Tom stood in the doorway of the guest room, his heart sinking. The space that had briefly held his mother was now empty, stripped of any evidence she had been there. The bed was perfectly made, corners tucked with military precision. On top of the folded blanket lay a single sheet of paper. With trembling fingers, Tom picked up the note. The handwriting was delicate, slightly shaky, like the hand that wrote it had been nervous. "Thank you for the little time I had with you." 7 words. That's all she'd left him with. 7 words to sum up a lifetime of separation, a few precious days of reconnection, and now another goodbye. Tom sank onto the bed, clutching the paper. The faint scent of lavender, her scent, still clung to the pillowcase. He closed his eyes, trying to hold on to the memory of her face, afraid it might slip away again. "I just found you," he whispered to the empty room. For 3 days, Tom barely slept. He wandered the streets near his building, showing Grace's photo, an old picture he'd found in those sealed files, to anyone who might have seen her. Doormen, street vendors, the homeless people who gathered in the small park nearby. "She's about 5'4", silver hair, kind eyes," he'd say, his voice growing more desperate with each person who shook their head. He visited 4 homeless shelters waiting in lines, speaking to volunteers who looked at him, in his $1,000 suit, with suspicion, until he explained. "She's my mother. I just found her again and now she's gone." At the St. Mary's Soup Kitchen, an elderly volunteer with kind eyes put a hand on his arm. "People come and go here, dear. Some don't want to be found." "But I need to find her," Tom insisted, his voice cracking. "I didn't get to tell her." He couldn't finish the sentence. What hadn't he told her? That he forgave her? That he understood? That despite everything, some part of him had recognized her from the moment she appeared. On the 4th day, Julia came to his apartment. Tom hadn't been to the office, hadn't answered calls about the merger. She found him at his dining table, surrounded by maps marked with red circles, shelters, food banks, clinics. "Tom," she said softly, setting down her bag, "when's the last time you slept?" He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "I can't sleep. She's out there somewhere, Julia. Alone." Julia pulled out a chair and sat beside him. She studied his face, the stubble on his usually clean-shaven jaw, the hollow look in his eyes. But there was something else there too, a fire she'd never seen before. "You know," she said carefully, "you look more alive chasing her than you ever did chasing your father's approval." Tom stared at her, the words hitting him like a physical blow. His face crumpled, the careful mask he'd worn his entire adult life finally breaking completely. "What if I never find her?" he whispered, his voice raw. "What if I lost her again before I even had the chance to know her?" Julia reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We'll find her, Tom. We will." The shelter worker's office was small and cramped, with filing cabinets stacked against peeling walls and a desk overflowing with papers. Tom sat on a metal folding chair, his expensive suit looking out of place among the worn furniture. His eyes were fixed on the small computer screen where grainy footage played. "This is from our intake interviews," explained Ms. Winters, the shelter director. "We record them for our records. This one's from about 8 years ago." On the screen, a woman with familiar, gentle eyes sat nervously in a chair. Her hair was darker then, with only hints of gray, but Tom would recognize her anywhere. His mother. "Name?" asked an off-camera voice. The woman hesitated. "Maggie," she finally said. "Maggie Wilson." Tom leaned forward. "Maggie? But her name is Grace." Ms. Winters nodded. "Many women use different names when they come to us. Some are running from something, or someone. But why Maggie specifically?" Tom wondered aloud. "She told me once it was a childhood nickname," Ms. Winters said. "Her grandmother called her that. Said she had magic in her hands because she could fix anything." Tom felt his throat tighten. Another piece of his mother's life he'd never known. The footage continued. Maggie, Grace, spoke softly about needing temporary housing. She didn't mention a son, didn't mention her past, but her eyes held a sadness that Tom now recognized. "She stayed with us for 4 months," Ms. Winters explained, turning off the video. "Longest-serving volunteer we ever had. The women loved her." "What did she do here?" Tom asked. Ms. Winters smiled. "Everything. Cleaned, organized donations. But mostly she cooked. Made miracles happen with whatever we had in the pantry." She paused. "I caught her giving up her own meals for the children sometimes. When I confronted her, she just said they need it more than me." Tom closed his eyes, imagining his mother hungry, giving her food to other people's children while missing her own. "Even after she found a small apartment, she came back to volunteer," Ms. Winters continued. "Her spirit lingered here long after she left. Some of our recipes still have her handwriting on them." Tom thanked Ms. Winters and left with a slip of paper containing an address, another shelter where Grace had volunteered more recently. By nightfall, Tom found himself in an even more run-down part of the city. The women's shelter was housed in an old church basement, the steps worn smooth from years of desperate footsteps. An elderly woman named Ruth met him at the door, eyeing him suspiciously until he explained his search. "Grace?" Her face softened immediately. "Of course I remember her. Such a gentle soul." Ruth led Tom to a small kitchen where women were preparing dinner. She taught half these ladies how to cook, said everyone deserves a warm meal made with love. "Did she ever even talk about her past?" Tom asked carefully. Ruth's eyes grew sad. "Not much during the day, but at night." She lowered her voice. "She stayed in the volunteer room sometimes. Thin walls. I heard her crying." Tom felt his heart constrict. "Crying?" Ruth nodded slowly. "Every night for a son she lost. Said she prayed he was happy, even if she couldn't be part of his life." The words pierced Tom to his core. He steadied himself against the wall, suddenly dizzy with grief. "She never stopped loving you," Ruth said, somehow knowing exactly who he was. "Never." The city skyline was still tinted pink and gold when Tom strode into the Bennett Tower. His steps were firm, his mind made up. The security guard's surprised greeting went unanswered as he headed straight for the elevator. Charles Bennett was already at his desk, reviewing documents for the merger that would add another billion to their empire. He barely looked up when Tom entered. "You're early," Charles noted, his voice crisp and businesslike. "Good. We need to review the final terms before—" "I'm pulling out," Tom interrupted. Charles's pen stopped mid-signature. "Excuse me?" "I'm pulling out of the merger," Tom repeated, his voice steady. "All of it. I won't be part of this anymore." Charles slowly set down his pen and leaned back in his leather chair. His face remained calm, but his eyes hardened like ice. "Is this about that woman? Your so-called mother?" The word dripped with disdain. "This is about who I want to be," Tom replied, "and who I don't want to be anymore." Charles's laugh was cold. "You think you can just walk away from everything I built for you? Everything I sacrificed to give you?" "Sacrificed?" Tom felt anger rising in his chest. "You sacrificed nothing. You stole my mother from me. You stole my choice." Charles stood, his palms flat on the desk. "I protected you from weakness. From her weakness." "No," Tom shook his head. "You protected yourself, your image, your precious legacy." "If you walk away now," Charles warned, his voice dangerously quiet, "don't bother coming back. You'll have nothing." Tom looked around the office, the awards, the photographs of handshakes with politicians and celebrities, the view of a city they'd helped reshape. All of it suddenly felt hollow. "I already have nothing," Tom said simply and turned to leave. 2 hours later, Tom stood on the driveway of his childhood home in Greenwich, Connecticut. The sprawling mansion looked smaller somehow, less imposing than in his memories. Mrs. Peterson, their former housekeeper who now lived in the cottage on the property, shuffled toward him with a tentative smile. "Master Tom," she said, using the old title that now made him wince. "What a surprise." "Just Tom, please," he corrected gently. "I wanted to see the house again." She nodded, unlocking the front door with a key from her pocket. Your father keeps it maintained, though he rarely visits. Tom stepped into the grand foyer, memories washing over him. Christmas mornings, birthday parties with children he barely knew, formal dinners where he learned which fork to use before he learned to ride a bike. It was different when you were very small, Mrs. Peterson said softly beside him. Before my mother left? Tom finished. The old woman's eyes grew sad. The house always felt like it was missing something after your mom left, a warmth that never came back. Tom walked through the halls alone, running his fingers along expensive wallpaper and ornate door frames. He paused at his childhood bedroom, preserved like a museum exhibit of a life half-lived. For the first time, standing among all this wealth, Tom realized a terrible truth. His fortune hadn't come from success. It had come from stolen love. Tom's hands trembled as he lifted the dusty cardboard box from the shelter's donation pile. The worker had mentioned it came from an elderly woman who'd volunteered there for years. Maggie's things, she'd said, using the name Grace had gone by. She left these behind when she moved on, the shelter worker explained. Said someone might need the old blankets and books more than her. Tom carried the box to a quiet corner of the shelter's common room. Inside were a few worn paperbacks, a hand-knitted scarf, and beneath them, a small, leather-bound photo album with faded gold trim. His heart pounded as he opened the cover. The first page held a single photograph, a young woman, unmistakably Grace, sitting in a park, cradling a baby. The summer sunlight caught in her hair, her smile radiant as she looked down at the infant in her arms. At him. Summer 1965 was written in delicate handwriting below. Tom turned the pages slowly, each one revealing another moment from a life he never knew he'd had. Grace pushing a stroller. Grace feeding him in a high chair, her face a picture of patience and love. Grace holding him as they stood in front of a modest apartment building, pride shining in her eyes. When he turned to the final page, a yellowed newspaper clipping slipped out and fell to the floor. Tom picked it up, his fingers numb as he read the headline, Bennett Heir Custody Finalized, Mother Deemed Unfit. The article was brief but brutal. It spoke of Charles Bennett's victory in court, of the unstable young woman who had wisely relinquished her claims to the Bennett heir. There was no mention of Grace's side of the story, no hint of the truth. Something hardened in Tom's chest. He needed more. 3 hours later, Tom sat in the county courthouse archives, surrounded by dusty files and transcripts. The clerk had been reluctant at first, but Tom's determination, and perhaps the desperation in his eyes, had convinced her to help. The court records told a story that made him sick. Page after page revealed how Grace had been systematically silenced, belittled, and manipulated. Charles's expensive lawyers had painted her as unstable, unfit, opportunistic. Her modest background and lack of education were used as weapons against her. One transcript in particular broke him. Judge, Ms. Wilson, why should the court believe you can provide for this child? Grace, I love my son. I may not have money, but I have. Bennett attorney, Your Honor, love doesn't pay for education. Love doesn't secure a future. Grace, please, I just want... Judge, Ms. Wilson, please refrain from emotional outbursts. Her love had never wavered, but she never stood a chance against Charles's power and influence. Tom stumbled out to the courthouse parking lot, the weight of the truth crushing him. He slumped against his car and broke down, tears streaming down his face as 30 years of lies crumbled around him. His phone rang. Julia's name flashed on the screen. Tom? Her voice was urgent. I think I found her. Someone at the downtown free clinic says they saw a woman matching Grace's description yesterday. She was volunteering there. Tom burst through the clinic's glass doors, his expensive suit jacket unbuttoned and his tie loosened. The sterile smell of disinfectant hit him as he scanned the busy waiting room. Mothers with feverish children, elderly men clutching prescription papers, and tired-looking staff moved about the small space. Can I help you? A nurse with kind eyes and graying hair approached him. I'm looking for someone, Tom said, his voice cracking slightly. He pulled out his phone and showed her a photo he'd taken of the old picture from the album. This woman. Her name is Grace Wilson, but she might go by Maggie. I heard she was here recently. The nurse's eyes widened with recognition. Oh yes, I remember her. Sweet lady. She came by about a week ago, volunteering to help fold linens and sort donations. She paused, her brow furrowing. But she was coughing something awful. I tried to get her to see one of our doctors, but she refused. Did she say where she was staying, anything at all? Tom's hands were shaking. No, but she was worried about being a burden. Said, and I remember this clearly, that someone needed her more than she needed herself. The nurse shook her head. I gave her some cough medicine, but she wouldn't take anything else. Tom's heart sank. Do you have any idea where she went? I'm sorry, honey, she just thanked me and left. The nurse hesitated. She looked tired, thin, like she hadn't been eating well. Tom thanked her and headed toward the exit, his mind racing. As he pushed open the door, he overheard two volunteers talking. That older lady who was helping last week, I saw her at the park yesterday feeding those stray cats again. Tom spun around. Excuse me, the park? Which one? Riverside Park by the old fountain, the young woman replied, surprised by his intensity. She goes there most afternoons, I think. Without another word, Tom ran out the door and hailed a taxi. Riverside Park as fast as you can, he told the driver, his heart pounding in his chest. The park was busy with afternoon visitors when Tom arrived. He rushed past joggers and dog walkers, scanning every bench and pathway. The fountain came into view, its water sparkling in the afternoon sun, but there was no sign of Grace. A vendor selling hot pretzels caught his eye. Tom approached, slightly out of breath. Excuse me, have you seen an older woman here? Gray hair, thin, probably feeding the strays. He showed the vendor the photo on his phone. The vendor nodded immediately. Oh yeah, I know who you mean, she's here most days. He pointed toward a cluster of trees. She sits over there, singing real quiet-like to those cats. Beautiful voice. Singing? Tom's voice caught in his throat. Yeah, some old lullaby about stars and dreams. Same one every day. The vendor looked at Tom more closely. Sweet woman. Looked like she hadn't eaten in days, though. I offered her a pretzel yesterday, but she just smiled and said she was fine. When was the last time you saw her? Tom asked, hope rising in his chest. This morning, actually, early. She had that cough, something terrible. The vendor pointed again. Try the east side of the park. She sometimes feeds the birds over there, too. Tom thanked him and hurried in the direction the man had pointed, his heart racing with both fear and hope. Tom's heart pounded as he jogged along the winding path. The trees cast long shadows across the grass, and the afternoon light filtered through the leaves in golden patches. He scanned every bench, every quiet corner where someone might rest unnoticed. Then he heard it, sirens wailing in the distance. A chill ran down his spine as the sound grew louder. Tom quickened his pace, something pulling him toward the park entrance. As he rounded the bend, his worst fears materialized before him. An ambulance, its lights flashing, was parked at the curb. A small crowd had gathered under a cluster of oak trees, forming a tight circle around someone on the ground. Please no, Tom whispered, breaking into a run. He pushed through the crowd, mumbling apologies as he shoved past onlookers. Excuse me, I need to... His voice died in his throat as he broke through to the center. There, lying on the grass with EMTs hovering over her, was Grace. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. An oxygen mask covered her nose and mouth, but he could still hear her, faintly humming that same lullaby between labored breaths. Grace? Tom dropped to his knees beside her. What happened? He asked one of the EMTs, a young woman checking Grace's vital signs. Collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration, possible pneumonia. The EMT replied without looking up. Are you family? Tom's voice broke as he answered. Yes, I'm her son. Grace's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. They widened with recognition, filling with tears. Tom, she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the mask. I'm here now, Tom said, taking her frail hand in his. Her skin felt paper-thin and cool to the touch. I'm here. and I'm not leaving again." The EMTs worked quickly, lifting Grace onto a stretcher. Her fingers tightened around Tom's, unwilling to let go. "We need to get her to the hospital," one of the EMTs said. "You can follow in your car." "No," Tom said firmly. "I'm riding with her." As they loaded the stretcher into the ambulance, Tom climbed in beside her, never letting go of her hand. The doors closed behind them, shutting out the curious stares of the crowd. In the privacy of the ambulance, with only the EMTs as witnesses, Tom's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his face as he leaned close to Grace. "Mom," he said, the word feeling both foreign and deeply familiar on his lips. "Please stay with me. I need you now more than ever." Grace's eyes met his, a lifetime of love and longing reflected in them. Her lips moved beneath the oxygen mask, still softly humming the lullaby she'd sung to him as a baby, the melody that had brought them back together after all these years. The hospital corridor buzzed with quiet activity. Nurses moved from room to room, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The antiseptic smell hung in the air, sharp and clean. Tom Bennett sat on a hard plastic chair outside Grace's room, his expensive suit wrinkled, his tie loosened around his neck. His mind raced through the events of the past few weeks, the chance encounter outside his building, the woman who made his apartment feel like a home, the lullaby that had unlocked forgotten memories, the devastating truth about his father's lies. Tom rubbed his eyes, red and swollen from crying. He hadn't shed tears since he was a child, and now they seemed to flow without permission. He stared at the closed door to Grace's room, where doctors were still working to stabilize her condition. "How is she?" Tom looked up to see Julia standing before him, 2 paper cups of coffee in her hands. Her face was etched with concern, not just for Grace, but for him. "They're still in there," Tom said, his voice hoarse. "Pneumonia, dehydration, malnutrition. She's been living on the streets, Julia, while I had heated floors and Egyptian cotton sheets." Julia handed him a coffee and sat beside him. "You didn't know, Tom." "I should have." He took the coffee but didn't drink it. All those years, thinking she abandoned me, believing my father's lies, and she was out there, loving me from a distance. Julia placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You found her now. That's what matters." Tom shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I've never felt more ashamed in my life." He paused, looking down at his hands. "And yet, I've never felt more alive. Isn't that strange? I had everything, Julia, except the one person who loved me first." They sat in silence for a moment, the hospital sounds filling the space between them. "What will you do now?" Julia asked quietly. Before Tom could answer, the door to Grace's room opened. A doctor emerged, looking tired but not grim. Tom jumped to his feet. "Mr. Bennett?" The doctor extended his hand. "I'm Dr. Patel. Your mother is stable now." Tom's heart leapt at the words "your mother," not the patient or Ms. Grace, but your mother. The connection was real, acknowledged. "She's severely malnourished and the pneumonia is concerning, but we've started her on antibiotics and fluids. With proper care and rest, she should recover." "Can I see her?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Patel nodded. "She's resting, but yes, just keep it brief for now." Tom turned to Julia, who smiled and squeezed his hand. "Go," she said. "I'll be right here." Taking a deep breath, Tom pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dim, with only a small light above the bed. Grace lay there, looking impossibly small beneath the hospital blankets. An IV dripped steadily into her arm, and a monitor beeped softly, tracking her heartbeat. Tom approached the bed slowly, as if afraid she might disappear. He sank into the chair beside her and gently took her hand in his. Her skin was warm now, a good sign. "I'm here, Mom," he whispered, the word still new on his tongue. "You're not going through this alone anymore." The grand ballroom of the Bennett Tower glittered with camera flashes. Reporters filled the rows of chairs, their notepads ready and recorders running. At the podium, Charles Bennett stood tall in his immaculate charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. His face wore the practiced smile of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "The Bennett Group is proud to announce our merger with Westfield International," Charles announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "This $10 billion deal represents the future of our company and secures the Bennett legacy for generations to come." The reporters scribbled furiously. In the back of the room, several whispered among themselves. "Where's the son?" one murmured. "I heard he's gone AWOL," another replied. Charles continued his speech, but the undercurrent of whispers grew. The absence of Tom Bennett, the heir apparent, was impossible to ignore. A brave reporter raised her hand during the question period. "Mr. Bennett, there are rumors of a family rift. Can you comment on your son's absence today?" Charles's smile tightened. "My son is attending to personal matters. The Bennett Group continues under my leadership, as it always has." Just then, the double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. The crowd turned as one. Tom Bennett walked in, dressed not in his usual tailored suit, but in simple slacks and a button-down shirt. His face was pale but determined. Julia stood in the doorway behind him, giving him a supportive nod. The room fell silent as Tom walked straight down the center aisle. Security guards looked to Charles for direction, but he stood frozen at the podium, his knuckles white against the wood. "I apologize for interrupting," Tom said, his voice carrying through the hushed room. He stepped onto the stage beside his father. "But I can't let this continue without speaking the truth." Charles leaned toward him, whispering harshly, "Get off this stage now." Tom ignored him, facing the crowd of reporters whose cameras now flashed frantically. "Effective immediately, I am stepping down from my position at the Bennett Group," Tom announced. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. "I cannot and will not build my life on silence and shame." Charles's face flushed deep red. "You ungrateful?" "For 30 years, Tom continued, his voice growing stronger, "I believed a lie, that my mother abandoned me, that she didn't want me." His voice caught. "The truth is, she was forced out of my life by a man who valued power and appearances over love and family." Charles grabbed Tom's arm. "That's enough." Tom pulled away. "No, it's not nearly enough." He faced the cameras directly. "There are more important things than deals, like the people we forget and the family we throw away." Charles stormed off the stage, shoving past a security guard. The reporters jumped to their feet, shouting questions, cameras flashing like lightning. Tom stood alone at the podium, his shoulders straight, looking more like himself than he had in years. Sunlight streamed through the large windows of Pine Grove Rehabilitation Center, casting a warm glow across Grace's small room. The sterile white walls had transformed over the past 3 weeks. Colorful get-well cards lined the windowsill, fresh daisies brightened the bedside table, and a soft quilt from Tom's apartment draped across the foot of the bed. Grace sat propped up against her pillows, her thin frame looking stronger than when she'd first arrived. The color had returned to her cheeks, and though she still tired easily, her eyes sparkled with new life. Tom entered carrying a stack of books and another bouquet of flowers. "More books?" Grace smiled, her voice still slightly raspy. "I haven't finished the ones from yesterday." "These are different," Tom said, setting the flowers in a vase. "The nurse mentioned you used to read poetry to the women at the shelter." Grace's eyes widened as she recognized the collection. "Emily Dickinson, how did you know?" "I've been talking to people, learning about you." Tom sat in the chair beside her bed, the one he'd occupied every day since her admission. "The shelter director said you could recite, 'Hope is the thing with feathers,' from memory." Grace nodded, her eyes misting. "Poetry helped me through the darkest times. When I couldn't afford books, I'd memorize poems at the library." A nurse knocked gently before entering with Grace's medication. "You two are becoming our favorite soap opera around here," she teased, checking Grace's vital signs. "Blood pressure's looking better today, Grace." "Maggie's fine," Grace said softly. "It's what everyone called me for years." After the nurse left, Tom leaned forward. "Why did you change your name?" Grace's fingers twisted the edge of her blanket. "After I lost you, I couldn't bear hearing my own name. Every time someone said Grace, I remembered signing those papers." She swallowed hard. "Becoming Maggie helped me survive." Tom reached for her hand. "Tell me about those years. I want to know everything." Grace spoke of shelter beds and minimum wage jobs, of crying herself to sleep on Tom's birthday each year, of volunteering at women's centers because helping other mothers in crisis gave her purpose. "I saved every penny I could," she explained, "hoping someday I might have enough to fight for you legally. But your father's lawyers—" Her voice trailed off. Tom nodded, understanding the impossibility she'd faced. "And I grew up thinking I had everything," he said bitterly. "The best schools, the best clothes, the best opportunities. But I was always empty inside." He squeezed her hand. "Now I understand why." The door opened again, and Julia appeared, carrying a cardboard box. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, smiling warmly at Grace. "But I thought you might want this." "What is it?" Grace asked. "Your belongings from Hope House Shelter," Julia explained, setting the box on the bed. "When you didn't return, they packed up your things. I tracked them down." Grace's hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside lay a worn Bible, a faded sweater, a small photo album, and beneath it all, a yellowed piece of construction paper, folded carefully. She unfolded it slowly. The crayon drawing showed two stick figures, one tall with yellow hair, one small with a big smile. Above them in wobbly letters, "Mom and me." Grace pressed the drawing to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "You made this in preschool," she whispered. "The day before." She couldn't finish. Tom moved to sit on the edge of the bed, his own eyes wet. "You never stopped being my mom," he said, his voice breaking, "even when I didn't know it." 3 months after Grace's hospitalization, Tom's gleaming Italian leather shoes had been replaced by sensible work boots. His tailored suits hung untouched in his closet, while his new uniform, jeans and a plain button-down, had become his daily wear. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, he walked through the doors of Hope House Shelter, the place where Grace had once found purpose during her darkest days. Today, Tom stood behind the serving counter, ladling hot stew into bowls for the line of people waiting patiently. His sleeves were rolled up, and a plain apron protected his clothes. The steam from the pot warmed his face as he smiled at each person, making eye contact and offering a genuine, "Enjoy your meal." "Little more for me today, rich boy?" teased Marcus, a regular with a graying beard and kind eyes. "My stomach knows it's Thursday." Tom chuckled and added an extra spoonful. "Just don't tell anyone I'm playing favorites." "Your secret's safe," Marcus winked, moving down the line. Across the room, Diane, the volunteer coordinator, was showing new helpers how to set up the tables. She caught Tom's eye and gave him an approving nod. When he'd first arrived 3 months ago, stiff, awkward, and clearly out of his element, she'd been skeptical. But Tom had proven himself, showing up consistently and doing whatever was needed without complaint. After serving, Tom moved to the dish station, rolling up his sleeves further as he plunged his hands into soapy water. The mindless task gave him time to think. His father hadn't spoken to him since the press conference. The Bennett Corporation had proceeded with the merger without him. His bank account, while still substantial, no longer received the regular influx of company profits. And yet Tom had never felt richer. "Need a hand?" A familiar voice broke through his thoughts. Tom looked up to find Grace standing beside him, her health much improved. She wore a simple cardigan and slacks, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Mom," he said, the word still new on his lips but feeling more natural each time. "I didn't know you were coming today." Grace picked up a dish towel. "Diane called. Said I should see something special." She began drying the clean plates Tom handed her. "I've been watching you for the last 15 minutes. Tom felt suddenly self-conscious. I'm still learning. Probably not doing things as efficiently as you would. Grace shook her head, her eyes shining. That's not what I meant. They worked side by side for a few minutes before Grace spoke again. Remember when you found me in the park that day? She asked softly. Tom nodded, the memory of her collapsed form still haunting him. I thought I'd found my purpose here, Grace continued, gesturing around the shelter. Helping others because I couldn't help you. She touched his arm, leaving a small wet spot on his sleeve. But watching you today, I realized something. Tom stopped washing and turned to face her. You didn't just find me, Grace whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You found yourself. Tom looked around the bustling shelter, at Marcus joking with another guest, at Diane patiently training new volunteers, at the wall where children's artwork hung in colorful display. I spent my whole life chasing success, Tom said quietly, but I never knew what it actually felt like until now. A man approached them, hesitating slightly. Tom recognized him as a newcomer who'd arrived last week. You're the rich guy, right? He asked Tom. From the news? The Bennett heir? Tom tensed slightly but nodded. The man smiled unexpectedly. Funny thing is, you look like one of us now. Tom smiled back, feeling something bloom in his chest, something warm and genuine. Thank you, he said. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in a long time. The grandfather clock in the Bennett mansion foyer struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the cavernous space. Tom stood motionless for a moment, listening to the sound that had marked so many silent nights of his childhood. He hadn't called ahead. He hadn't planned this visit. But something had drawn him here tonight. His footsteps were nearly silent on the plush carpet as he made his way through the dimly lit hallways. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Bennett men with stern faces and proud postures. Tom's own portrait, taken when he was 18, stared back at him with empty eyes. Success without joy, Tom whispered to his younger self. The house felt larger than he remembered, or perhaps he had simply grown smaller in its absence. Each room held memories, piano lessons he never wanted, business dinners where he wasn't allowed to speak, Christmas mornings with expensive gifts but no laughter. Light spilled from beneath the study door at the end of the hall. Tom paused, took a deep breath, and knocked softly. Enter. The voice was firm but tired. Charles Bennett sat in his leather chair by the window, a glass of scotch in hand. He didn't turn when Tom entered, his gaze fixed on the dark gardens outside. I wondered when you'd come back, Charles said, still not looking at him. Tom remained near the door. I'm not coming back. Not permanently. I just needed... He paused, searching for the right words. I needed to say goodbye properly. Charles finally turned. In the dim light, Tom noticed how much older his father looked. The lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders slightly stooped. The board misses you, Charles said. The Harrington deal isn't going as smoothly as we projected. Tom smiled sadly. That's not why I'm here. Silence stretched between them. Charles took a sip of his scotch, then set the glass down with deliberate care. I did what I thought was best, he finally said. Your mother, Grace, she would have made you soft. This world doesn't reward softness, Tom. Is that what you think happened? Tom asked quietly. That she softened me? Charles looked away again. Look at you, working in shelters, giving away money. That's not the son I raised. Tom moved closer, stopping at the edge of the desk that had always served as a barrier between them. She didn't soften me, Tom said firmly. She made me whole. Charles's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. I spent my life trying to be enough for you, Tom continued. I never realized how empty that made me until I found her. The clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping gently against the windows. Goodbye, Father, Tom said simply. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just quiet finality. As he turned to leave, Charles spoke again. Tom. Tom paused at the door. "Are you happy?" Charles asked, his voice barely audible. Tom thought of Grace's smile, of the shelter, of the purpose he'd found. "Yes," he answered. "I am." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one anymore. Tom walked out of the study and through the silent halls of his past, carrying not anger, but peace. The early morning sun painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges as Tom and Grace stood side by side, watching the transformation happening before them. The small brick building that had once been abandoned was now buzzing with activity. Volunteers moved in and out carrying paint cans, furniture, and boxes of supplies. A simple banner hung across the entrance. "Coming soon, the Grace and Tom Foundation." Tom took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs. "It doesn't seem real yet," he said quietly. Grace smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Her face had filled out in the weeks since her hospital stay, and there was a healthy glow to her cheeks that hadn't been there before. "But it is real," she said. "Look at it." Inside, volunteers were painting the walls a warm yellow. Others arranged bookshelves along one wall, already starting to fill them with donated books. The kitchen area buzzed with activity as people unpacked dishes and organized cooking supplies. Julia emerged from inside, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, a smudge of paint on her cheek. "The computer lab is all set up," she announced proudly. "And we've got 5 people signed up for the first job skills class next week." Tom nodded, his throat tight with emotion. This place was so different from the cold, sterile Bennett corporate offices. Here, there was laughter and purpose, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Do you think people will come?" he asked, suddenly uncertain. Grace placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her touch was still new to him, still something he was learning to accept after so many years without it. But it felt right. It felt like home. "They'll come," she said softly, "because they need to know they matter. That's what I needed all those years ago, just to know I wasn't invisible." Tom covered her hand with his own. "We can't change the past," he began. "But we can make sure no one else gets left behind," Grace finished, her eyes shining with unshed tears. A young volunteer approached them holding a tray of coffee cups. "Would you like some coffee, Mrs. Bennett? Mr. Bennett?" Grace looked startled for a moment, then smiled. "Just Grace, honey, and yes, thank you." Tom watched as she took the cup and chatted easily with the volunteer. His mother had a gift for making people feel seen, for creating connection where there had been none. It was a gift he was slowly learning from her. The day of the grand opening arrived with perfect weather, gentle sunshine and a cool breeze that made the new banner flutter above the entrance. The Grace and Tom Foundation stood transformed, its brick exterior freshly cleaned, windows gleaming. What had once been a forgotten building on a quiet street now pulsed with new life and purpose. Inside, the walls glowed with warm yellows and soft blues. Local artwork hung in simple frames, paintings donated by community artists, photographs of the neighborhood's history, and children's artwork from nearby schools. Hand-sewn quilts draped over the backs of comfortable chairs, each one telling its own story through fabric and thread. Tom stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. He wore a simple button-down shirt rather than his usual tailored suit. The change in his appearance was striking. Gone was the polished corporate air, replaced by a man whose smile reached his eyes. "Can you believe this?" Julia whispered, appearing at his side. 2 months ago, this place was empty. Tom shook his head. "I still can't believe any of it." The community room filled quickly with people from all walks of life, shelter volunteers, local business owners, families from the neighborhood, and even a few curious reporters. A small podium had been set up at the front of the room with a microphone that squeaked when Tom approached it. He cleared his throat, suddenly nervous. Public speaking had never bothered him before. He'd given countless presentations to rooms full of investors. But this was different. This mattered more. "Thank you all for coming today," he began. "A few months ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was and what my life would be. I was wrong." His voice caught slightly. "This foundation exists because sometimes we need to be reminded of what truly matters: connection, compassion, and second chances. Tom's speech was brief and heartfelt. When he finished, he turned to Grace, who sat in the front row. And now, the person who made all of this possible. My mother, Grace Bennett. Grace approached the podium slowly. She wore a simple blue dress and a small pendant around her neck, the locket that had brought them back together. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "I never thought I'd stand here," she said, her voice soft but clear. "For years, I lived in the shadows of what I'd lost." Tears welled in her eyes. "This isn't just a building. It's proof that even broken things can be rebuilt." The room erupted in applause. Grace wiped her eyes, smiling through her tears. As the clapping subsided, a small boy, no more than 6 years old, broke away from his mother and approached the podium. In his hands, he clutched a piece of construction paper with a crayon drawing on it. "This is for you," he said shyly, holding it up to Grace. "You remind me of my grandma." The drawing showed 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. Grace knelt down to the boy's level, taking the picture with gentle hands. "Thank you," she whispered, opening her arms. The boy stepped into her embrace without hesitation. Grace held him close, her eyes brimming with emotion as she looked over his shoulder at Tom. After the ceremony, the community room transformed into a space for lunch. Volunteers served homemade dishes on donated plates, while conversations hummed throughout the room. Grace moved between tables, thanking everyone for coming, her face glowing with quiet joy. Tom watched his mother from across the room. She moved with purpose, touching shoulders, remembering names. This was the woman who had been hidden from him for decades, not weak or unfit as his father had claimed, but strong in ways wealth could never measure. As Grace paused near the dessert table, an older woman with silver-streaked hair approached her hesitantly. The woman's clothes were simple but neat, her posture straight with dignity. She touched Grace's arm gently. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're Maggie, aren't you? From St. Mary's Shelter?" Grace turned, confusion crossing her face before recognition dawned. "Lena, is that really you?" The woman nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "You used to help me when I had nothing. You saved my life." The 2 women embraced tightly, years of shared history passing between them. Tom moved closer, drawn by his mother's sudden emotion. "Tom," Grace said, wiping her eyes. "This is Lena. We met at the shelter. Oh, must be 15 years ago now." Lena smiled at Tom, extending her hand. "Your mother taught me how to cook, how to interview for jobs. She watched my children when I couldn't afford childcare." She straightened her shoulders proudly. "I'm an office manager now. My kids are in college." Tom shook her hand, feeling the strength in her grip. "It's wonderful to meet you." "Your mother changed more lives than you know," Lena continued, looking between Tom and Grace. "She never had much herself, but she gave everything she had." Tom felt something shift inside him, a final piece falling into place. He looked at his mother, this woman who had been erased from his life, who had suffered and struggled, yet had never stopped giving to others. "You didn't lose years," he said softly to Grace. "You multiplied them through others." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she reached for her son's hand. As summer turned to fall, the Grace and Tom Foundation became more than just a building. It transformed into the beating heart of the community. Each morning, the doors opened to welcome a steady stream of visitors seeking connection, support, and belonging. Children's laughter echoed through hallways once silent and sterile. Seniors gathered for hot lunches, their wisdom flowing freely across tables where no one ate alone. Families found refuge in workshops that taught everything from budgeting to parenting skills. Tom settled into a routine he never imagined for himself. Every Wednesday evening, he taught business basics to a packed room of eager faces, former homeless individuals, single parents, and immigrants hungry for opportunity. He used simple words to explain complex concepts, finding more fulfillment in these humble classes than in all his years in corporate boardrooms. "You've got a gift for this," Julia told him one evening after sitting in on his class. "They trust you." "They trust me because I'm not my father," Tom replied, organizing his notes. I'm just me. Grace's homemade healing baking sessions quickly became the center's most popular event. Every Friday, she taught people to create comfort from simple ingredients: cinnamon rolls, apple pies, and bread that filled the building with warmth and the scent of home. Baking isn't just about food, Grace would say, flour dusting her cheeks. It's about sharing stories and healing hearts. Around her table, strangers became friends as they kneaded dough and shared pieces of their lives. On a crisp Thursday evening during the center's weekly game night, Tom paused in the doorway, coffee in hand. The room buzzed with activity, card games, checkers, and laughter. But what caught his eye was Grace in the corner where someone had turned on an old record player. She was slow dancing with Mr. Winters, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke. Yet there he was, smiling gently as Grace led him in a simple waltz. Her face glowed with genuine joy, her movements graceful despite her years of hardship. Tom felt something catch in his throat. This woman, who had been denied everything, who had every reason to be bitter, radiated more love than anyone he'd ever known. This, he whispered to himself, this is what family looks like. The crisp autumn air wrapped around them like a gentle blanket as Tom and Grace sat side by side on the center's rooftop. Plastic chairs that had seen better days served as their thrones as they gazed up at the night sky. The city lights dimmed the stars, but a few persistent ones twinkled through, determined to be seen. Grace pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The sweater, a gift from one of the center's visitors, was handmade and slightly misshapen, but warmer than any designer piece Tom had ever bought. "Do you remember when you asked why I didn't fight harder for you?" Grace's voice was soft, barely audible above the distant street sounds below. Tom turned to look at her profile, illuminated by the glow of the string lights they'd hung around the rooftop garden. Her face, lined with years of struggle, held no bitterness, only a quiet peace that still amazed him. "I did," she continued, her eyes fixed on the stars above. "Every day since. I just never thought you'd find me." Her words hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Tom felt the weight of them, all those years, all that love, all that waiting. "I didn't find you," Tom replied, his voice catching slightly. "You came back just in time." Their hands found each other in the space between their chairs. Grace's fingers were rough from years of work, but they fit perfectly between his own. Neither spoke for a moment, letting the truth of their journey settle around them like the evening dew. Below them, the soft sound of laughter and music rose from the center's common room. Someone was playing the old piano they'd rescued from a thrift store. Children's voices mixed with adults in a cheerful cacophony that drifted upward. A world reborn beneath them. The afternoon sun filtered through the community center's windows, casting long rectangles of light across the worn but polished floors. The front door opened with a gentle creak, and Charles Bennett stepped inside. His expensive suit looked out of place among the handmade decorations and second-hand furniture. He moved with the stiffness of age and pride, his eyes scanning the bustling space. Grace was arranging flowers at the welcome desk when she spotted him. The vase nearly slipped from her hands. In all her imagined scenarios of this moment, she never thought he would come to her territory. "Charles," she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. He nodded, his usual commanding presence diminished somehow. "I'd like to speak with you. Privately, if possible." Grace led him to the small counseling room off the main hall. The space was simple: 2 comfortable chairs, a small table, a box of tissues. The walls were painted a soft blue that Grace had chosen herself. "I won't take much of your time," Charles said once the door closed behind them. His hands, once so steady in boardrooms and courthouses, fidgeted slightly. "I came to apologize." Grace sat perfectly still, waiting. "Not to excuse what happened," he continued, "but to acknowledge it. What I did to you, to Tom, was unforgivable. Yet here you are seeking forgiveness," Grace observed, no malice in her tone. Charles looked down at his hands. "I suppose I am." Grace took a deep breath. "I forgive you, Charles. Not because you deserve it, but because I do." I carried that weight too long." Something in Charles's face softened, not quite relief, but recognition. She led him back to the main hall where Tom was teaching a class to single fathers. Tom stood at a whiteboard, explaining budgeting with patience and humor. The men, some in work clothes, others in worn t-shirts, nodded and took notes. Charles watched in silence, his expression unreadable. "You raised him well," he finally whispered to Grace, "even when you weren't there." Before Grace could respond, Charles turned and walked toward the exit. His shoulders seemed lighter, though his steps were still measured and deliberate. The sky bloomed in shades of pink and gold as the sun peeked over the horizon. Morning dew sparkled on the grass surrounding the community center, catching light like tiny diamonds. In the garden beds that lined the walkway, a group of children knelt in the soft earth, their small hands carefully placing seedlings into the soil. Grace moved among them, her gray hair tucked beneath a simple scarf, her face aglow with purpose. As she helped a little girl with pigtails pat soil around a delicate marigold, she hummed softly, the same lullaby that had once connected her to Tom across years of separation. "Like this, Miss Grace?" the little girl asked, her hands covered in dirt. "Perfect, sweetheart," Grace answered, her voice warm as sunshine. "These flowers will grow strong and beautiful just like you." Inside the center, Tom stood before the main wall, carefully adjusting a newly framed photograph. It showed him as a toddler, cradled in Grace's young arms, their smiles mirroring each other. The photo had been painstakingly restored from the damaged original he'd found in the old custody files. Julia handed him a small brass plaque, which he mounted beneath the photo. The engraved words caught the morning light. "For every child who wonders where home is, it's right where love lives." "It's perfect," Julia said, stepping back to admire their work. Tom nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "It always was, I just couldn't see it." The center hummed with activity as volunteers prepared breakfast in the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee and baking bread filled the air. In the main room, tables were being set with mismatched plates and colorful napkins, each one donated with care. Tom walked outside to where Grace was finishing with the children. He offered his arm to her, and she took it with soil-stained fingers that he didn't mind at all. Together, they turned to face their growing community, a patchwork family of once strangers now bound by something stronger than blood. Elderly veterans chatted with young mothers. Teenagers helped toddlers water the new plants. Former shelter residents now served as volunteers. Tom and Grace waved to them all, their faces illuminated by the golden morning light that seemed to embrace everything it touched. If you enjoyed the story of Tom and Grace, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. If you enjoyed the story of Tom and Grace, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.